Hey everybody, mel0n here, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be finishing up part 2 of my review of the ZOWIE U2. Now this was a very unique mouse to test, this being one of ZOWIE's most unique mice they've ever released. This was a very weird one because this is very off the beaten path for ZOWIE. This is something very different from what they traditionally do, and this is kind of entering a new age of ZOWIE mice. However, this being their first step into this kind of new era for them, there were some executional errors, but I'm going to talk about that later in this video. Now before we get into it, I did want to say a huge thank you to ZOWIE, who was kind enough to send the U2 out for review. I greatly appreciate it. It's a pleasure being able to work with them again. As always, this video will be fully subtitled and timestamps will be available down in the description. Now, before we get into the full review, I did want to talk about kind of an awkward position I'm in when I do review the U2 here, and I wanted to kind of explain that and talk about that before we go into the full review. So let's talk about that first. Alrighty, now when it comes to the U2, a big part of ZOWIE's marketing for this mouse is its emphasis on being developed using sports science. As such, a lot of the promotional stuff for the U2 and a lot of the advertisements for the U2, including a lot of stuff on the product page, is talking about all the scientific advancements the U2 has over its competition, and I want to expand on that a little bit here. Now, to summarize ZOWIE's claims here with the U2, the scientific advancements are primarily focused on how the overall shell design of the U2 allows for a more relaxed and stable grip. On top of that, ZOWIE is highlighting that the left side of the U2 shell reduces the angle of the thumb, which stabilizes the muscle frequency, which results in a faster click speed with your index finger. While on the right side of the mouse, ZOWIE is saying that the U2's right side curvature allows for easy placement of the pinky finger and ring finger, and promotes a balanced force exertion on both sides of your hand, which gives a smoother, more dynamic experience on the U2. ZOWIE also makes a bunch of claims about the stability of the enhanced wireless receiver and the reliability of its performance within a high interference environment. Now, you may be wondering why I've kind of referred to these things as claims, and there's actually a very good reason for that. Over my testing with the U2, I was unfortunately unable to verify a single aspect of ZOWIE's marketing here with the U2. The main reason for this was the vagueness of their marketing. There is little to no information gained from the U2's marketing about what testing environment was used, the competitors that the U2 was compared against, what hand size was tested, what muscles were stabilized, how this faster actuation of the index finger actually works compared to the competition, what mice were tested against that. Even with the claims with the enhanced receiver, ZOWIE doesn't specify what environment it was tested in, what the competitors were, or what setting they were used to. The marketing is so vague. When I showed a lot of the marketing to Mrs. mel0n to get a non-reviewer perspective of them, she was actually extremely confused about the marketing and wasn't really able to make sense of a lot of it because it's so vague. It's not even really clear what the U2 does better over the competition in ZOWIE's own marketing. It's very, very vague and very confusing. Now, because of this, I actually reached out to my contact on ZOWIE and asked if I could see the data from their scientific testing on the U2 so I could have a baseline and do some of the testing myself here. But unfortunately, ZOWIE was unwilling to send out that data as it was confidential, which they have every right to do so. But it did make testing these claims very difficult because I had no baseline to verify anything here with the U2 and compared to the competition. However, my contact did verify that the data to support these claims does exist, so it leads me to a very awkward question of why didn't ZOWIE include these in the promotional material, the advertisements, and on the product page for the U2? Why make these super vague graphs that don't really tell you anything when you have hard scientific data to back up all these claims about the U2? So this left me in a very awkward spot with this mouse because I wasn't really able to verify anything because I don't have access to a sports testing lab and I don't have a baseline to kind of do testing on because ZOWIE wouldn't really provide me with one, unfortunately, which is really unfortunate. Now, to be abundantly clear here, I'm not saying that ZOWIE is lying about their claims. I actually believe ZOWIE. ZOWIE is probably the most trustworthy brand out there. I have no doubts that this scientific data for the U2 actually exists. I'm just kind of confused as to why they're not using this scientific data or some of this scientific data in their marketing and promotional materials to help people better understand what the U2 does better against the competition, because it doesn't really make sense to have their marketing be so vague and so confusing when they have this scientific data on hand. So unfortunately, I'm left in this very awkward situation of being a reviewer who can't fully review the U2 because I can't verify any of these claims from ZOWIE. Now, I very much understand that I'm kind of overcooking here, but as a reviewer, it's my job to fully review a product, and that's what I do with everything here on the channel. I probably go a little too much in depth to a lot of products, but I want to make sure I give the most accurate representation of everything I cover here on the channel. So I'm not going to be talking about those scientific claims in this video at all. All right, now with that whole spiel out of the way, let's go ahead and get started with the actual review of the ZOWIE U2 and talk about all the stuff I was able to verify and test myself. Alrighty, now let's talk about the in-game performance and how the ZOWIE U2 fared in-game. Now, this being ZOWIE's first step into a much more modern take on a gaming mouse and their first more dynamic aiming focused mouse, this mouse was definitely a bit of a weird one because again, this does not fall into a lot of the traditional pitfalls that ZOWIE mice do fall into, so it was very unique to test. Now, this mouse is heavily optimized for a more dynamic aiming style, and I was very interested to see if there were going to be any sacrifices into the static performance to make the dynamic performance performance of this mouse better. Now, over my testing period and testing it in game and doing game training and that kind of stuff on the ZOWIE U2, I found that the ZOWIE U2 was a very well optimized, very well all-round mouse, if that makes sense. There was no tech that really made the U2 perform better than other mice. It was just a very well optimized all-round mouse. There was no real sacrifices made in static performance to make the dynamic performance feel better. It was just a very good all-round mouse. Now, as I mentioned before, the U2 isn't perfect. The mouse performed great, but the shape is definitely one of the weakest parts of this mouse. So let's go ahead and talk about that next. Now, the shape of the U2 is actually surprisingly normal. It's not anything super fancy. It's just a fairly averagely sized symmetrical mouse. The measurements are 124 millimeters long. It is 65 millimeters wide at the base, 58 millimeters wide at the middle, and 60 millimeters wide at the top. And it is 38 millimeters tall at the peak of the hump. Now, this is a claw grip optimized symmetrical mouse, at least according to ZOWIE's marketing, which is accurate. However, as we talked about earlier with the whole scientific claims section, there is a pretty big difference between the left and right hand side of the mouse. Now, I'm not going to talk about what the scientific claims for those curves are. I'm just going to talk about how they feel. The left side of the U2 feels very similar to the left side of the Vaxi MP1OS, and the right side feels very similar just to like a standard hourglass shaped symmetrical mouse. There's nothing really fancy about it. It is comfortable to grip on the left hand side. However, the right side of the U2 was kind of uncomfortable for me to grip, but I'll talk about that a little later. Now, the entire shell of the U2 is quite curved. It's actually inwardly curved across most of the shell until you hit the rear flareouts on the mouse, which is very interesting. Now, unlike the rest of the U2 shell, the rear is wider than the rest of the shell. As I mentioned before, it's 65 millimeters wide, which does kind of bring into this hump section where the hump is slightly optimized towards the back of the mouse. Now, the overall hump feel of the U2 is a very standard thin and wide hump, which means the contact areas are going to be pretty standard for most hand sizes, but I'll talk about that later. It does feel fairly similar to the hump we found on the OGM Cloud, just obviously a lot smaller and a little less curved. All right, now for my 7.5 by 5 inch hands using a claw grip, the rear of the U2 makes most of its contact with the mid-high thenar region and my mid to low hypothenar, with a slight bit of contact in the mid palm, as expected with a shorter, wider rear shell hump. Now, I will say with my hand size, because I have really big hands, I find the contact area is most reliant on thenar and hyperthenar contact. If you have more medium hands, it'll be a lot more balanced between the hypothenar, the thenar, and the mid palm, but again, it'll vary on your hand size. Now, when you're claw gripping the U2, your thumb, your pinky, and your ring finger are going to be the primary contact points on the side of the mouse. And as I mentioned before, because of this like heavy inward tilted design of the U2 with this inward slant, does make this mouse kind of awkward to use in some situations. So I wanted to talk about that as well. Alrighty, now before we get into the issues with the U2 shell, I wanted to preface this that I have very big hands. I have 7.5 by 5 inch hands, so my situation may not be accurate for everybody. I just wanted to mention that off the top. I have used mice that are actually smaller than the U2 and very similar size to the U2 with very similar shells, and I haven't had issues before. So the issues I had with the U2 seem to be isolated to the U2 for whatever reason, so that's why I wanted to talk about them today. Now, my primary issue with the shape of the U2 is that the entire shell is just far too narrow. The sides of the mouse are way too aggressively inward tilted, specifically towards the front middle of the U2's sides, because the mouse is so narrow and the sides of the mouse are so aggressively tilted, you're almost entirely reliant on the coating and force pressure from your fingers to make your fingers actually grip onto the sides of the U2. For my 7.5 by 5 inch hands, I actually ran into some strain issues with my ring finger and my pinky finger, because since I'm forced to press into the sides of the U2 shell and the sides of the mouse are inwardly tilted, I had a lot of strain on these two fingers just trying to keep a natural balanced grip on the U2. The rest of my grip was perfect. The thumb area felt great and the thenar and hyperthenar contact was solid, but because of the issues I had were gripping the top right corner of the mouse with my pinky and my ring finger, the U2 felt unbalanced unless I was forcing my fingers into the side of the mouse, which caused strain problems. Due to this, it was actually more comfortable for me to do this weird spread grip where my ring finger and pinky finger actually rested against the mouse pad instead of on the mouse, which is a very awkward like claw grip hybrid spread grip, which was just very awkward for me to use, but I had to use it because I couldn't force my fingers into the side of the U2 due to this inward slant on the side. It was just very awkward and just led to strain damage on my hands. Now, I think ZOWIE could do quite a few things to the U2 shell to make it a little more comfortable. I think the biggest problem for me is this top right hand corner of the mouse where your pinky and your ring finger sit. Because the shell is so inwardly tilted and it's so aggressive, you have to force your fingers into the shell, which just gives strain problems, as I mentioned before. I think if ZOWIE lessened the tilt and made this area flat, it would be a lot more comfortable. They could also do exactly what Razer did with the Death Adder V3 Pro and the Death Adder V3 Wired, where the V3 Pro had this exact same problem where the pinky ring finger support was really bad in that mouse. So on the wired edition of the V3, they added that little ridge towards the top right hand corner of the mouse, which acted as like a pseudo resting point for your fingers. Doing that on the U2 would make the shell significantly better and would definitely help with tension issues with larger hands and make the mouse feel a lot more balanced. There are some other things that they could do with the mouse, but I'm going to talk about those a little later in this video. All right, now let's talk compatible hand sizes. Now the U2, since it is a fairly averagely sized mouse, is compatible compatible with a lot of hand sizes. However, the problem is that due to the shell of it, it does have some limitations to how compatible it is. So when it comes to smaller hands, it's going to be primarily only palm grip. Claw grip will not be usable on smaller hands because you won't really be able to go over the curvedness of the shell, if that makes sense. So small hands will be limited to palm grips. Medium hands are going to be the best suited use case for this mouse as expected due to its sizing. So medium sized hands can palm grip or claw grip the U2 very easily. Now, if you have 5 to 6.5 inch hands, you may be able to get away with a claw grip on the U2, but it's going to be very hit or miss depending on your hand size and how you claw grip your mouse. You could technically fingertip the U2 if you wanted to, but due to its weight and the size of the shell and that kind of stuff, it's not that great of a fingertip mouse. There are much better options available on the market for larger hands for fingertip grip. So large hand compatibility is surprisingly pretty bad here on the U2. As we've seen with a lot of mice in this size range, primarily they're made for medium to small hands. This one definitely has more of an emphasis on medium sized hands with claw grips as their primary best case use scenario. All right, now one area where ZOWIE has done a fantastic job with on the U2 is the coating. Now the U2's coating is the standard coating we've seen on all of ZOWIE's recent mice. It feels very matte-like, very minimal texture, but it does perform extremely well. It's very grippy for both wet and dry hands, and despite my sweatier hands, I didn't feel like I really need to readjust or wipe the mouse off during use, which is really great to see. The only downside I really say with this coating is that it does hold on to moisture and like grease and dust very easily. So your mouse does get grimy kind of quick, which is just kind of the standard thing with a lot of ZOWIE's coatings. So I did find myself wiping my U2 off with like a damp microfiber cloth fairly frequently to clean the mouse off, but that is kind of to be expected with a coating like this on a black mouse. Everything under the sun's going to show up on it. So the coating does perform extremely well. It just gets dirty very quickly, which is rather unfortunate, but I'd rather have a coating get dirty really quickly while still having insanely good performance. So ZOWIE did a really good job with the coating here on the U2. It actually performs exceptionally well. All right, now when it comes to build quality and QC, unsurprisingly, the build quality U2 is fantastic. This thing is built like an absolute truck. There's no creaking or flexing across the entire unit. It is just an extremely well built mouse. ZOWIE definitely has a reputation for their mice being exceptionally well built, and that is thankfully continuing here on the U2. This mouse is essentially perfect. I also did want to mention the internal build quality of the U2 is very impressive. Very intricate is a good way of saying it. It's probably one of the most over-engineered mice I've ever laid eyes on, but the internal build quality is actually very impressive, and it's a very rigid mouse overall. All right, now when it comes to QC, my U2 is perfect. There is no problems across my entire mouse, no creaking, flexing anywhere. It is just a very, very well built and very well QC'd mouse. Keep in mind, my mouse did come from ZOWIE directly. However, ZOWIE does have a reputation for just having incredibly well built and incredibly well QC'd mice, so that's to be expected here on the U2. But overall, the QC and build quality on the U2 is perfect. It is a very, very, very well built mouse, both externally and internally. All right, now when it comes to weight, the U2 is actually coming in a lot lower than we've seen from a lot of other ZOWIE mice. The U2 is only coming in at 68 grams. Now, compared to a lot of the other symmetrical mice we see on the market that are more in the 50 to 55 gram range, this may seem on the heavier side, but I kind of put ZOWIE mice in the same boat as the Vaxi mice. We have a little bit of a higher weight, but you also have exceptionally good build quality and QC, and the mouse just feels very solid overall. Just as I said when I reviewed the Vaxi MP01S, I'd rather use a mouse that is a little heavier but has absolutely perfect build quality and feels solid rather than a lighter mouse with various QC problems. Now, I will say the weight did take me a little time to get accustomed to, because again, 60 grams is a little on the heavier side compared to a lot of other mice, and I was coming to this from the Sprime PM1, which is a 43 gram mouse. There definitely was a bit of a transition period for me to get used to the weight here on the U2, but once I got accustomed to the weight on the U2, it was completely fine. I had no problems with it, and again, I barely noticed the 60 gram weight, and again, I'd rather have the heavier mouse with perfect QC and build quality rather than a lighter mouse with subpar build quality and QC. All right, next up, let's talk about the skates here on the U2. Now, the stock skates on the U2 are definitely very interesting. They're definitely rather unique, as with the rest of this entire mouse. It definitely falls into the very unique category. Now, these are ZOWIE's skates. These are the Type E black versions. They're 0.5 millimeter thick, and they're made out of 100% Teflon. The U2 does come with two sets. It does come with a pre-installed control set and an additional control set. Now, as you can see, these skates are very high surface area, probably the largest surface area skates I've seen on a mouse. To be completely honest, I was expecting more smaller, more speed optimized skates here on the U2 given its more dynamic aim focused design, but here we have these large control focus skates instead. Now, to ZOWIE's credit, I will say for stock skates, they're actually not bad. I generally hate really large surface area skates because the differencing of the XY axis performance, but these ones are actually surprisingly well balanced. The problem with them is that just because they're so big and there's so much contact area, they were just way too slow for a dynamic aiming focus mouse like this. These skates feel like something that should be on a traditional ZOWIE mouse, like a more tack or static oriented mouse. These skates just don't really make sense on a more dynamic focus mouse. Again, they don't feel bad for stock skates, but they definitely kind of worked against the intended nature of the U2 here. I'm honestly really surprised that ZOWIE didn't include their Type E speed skates with the U2, or maybe make like half-size stocks like we saw on the ZOWIE Cloud, just something to better complement the more dynamic aim focus on the U2, because the stock skates really go against that just because they're so slow. On the plus side though, ZOWIE did include skate removal ramps, which is nice to see. It did make removing the stock skates and replacing them with the X-ray pad donut obsidian skates very easy, but overall the stock skates are fine, I guess. I definitely think it'll be better going with aftermarkets or the speed skates from ZOWIE. The included ones just don't really make sense and just work against the dynamic focused aiming design here on the U2. Alrighty, next up let's talk about the main clicks on the U2. Now, keeping in line with a lot of the design decisions we've seen here on the U2, this is the most unique shell click implementation I've ever seen, and it's very, very strange, almost to the point of being over engineered and to the point where it's almost detrimental. But let's cover the bases first and we'll talk about why these unique clicks are so strange. Now, the click itself is actually part of the top shell entirely. The last mouse I remember seeing do this was the SteelSeries Sensei 10, so it's kind of a blast from the past to see here on the U2. The main clicks are using the same coating as the rest of the U2, which is fantastic to see, so it has the same very grippy coating we saw on the rest of the mouse. Now, the actual shell buttons are ever so slightly convex shell buttons. The curvature is closer to the center of the main click, and the convex indentation does go pretty far up the main click as well. So no matter where you position your fingers on the click, pretty much from the top of the click to around the middle low region of it, your fingers will naturally always go to the center of the click, which is a really nice attention to detail here. Now, in my unboxing video, I talked about the U2 and I was figuring that the inside click was going to be a Wano of some kind, and it turns out I was correct. However, I never would have guessed that the internal click here on the U2 is a standard Wano blue shell pink dot, which is like a super common switch and something I kind of didn't expect to see here on the U2. I knew it was going to be a Wano. I just figured it was going to be maybe like a different kind of switch. I didn't really expect seeing such a common switch here on the U2. To be fair, I don't really have a problem with it. I really do like the Wano blue shell pink dots. It's just kind of a surprise to see such a common mel switch on the U2 here. In terms of the pre and post travel, this is where the main clicks get really weird, because it turns out these are actually adjustable main clicks, which is something I have never seen before. So how I figured this out is I went to take the U2 apart to see what the internals were, see what the specs in the MCU was for my review, and there were these two screws towards the top of the mouse that I took out, and I figured, oh, there's just probably like some kind of anchoring screw. However, when I went to go put the mouse back together and I put these screws back in, my main clicks wouldn't actuate, and I had like a panic moment thinking I broke the switches somehow. So I took the mouse apart and I looked on the inside and I didn't see anything that was out of the ordinary. So I did it a couple more times until I finally figured out that these two tiny screws at the top are actually tensioning the main clicks. So what happens is that these two little screws go into the top shell and they actually pull the PCB part of the board where the clicks are. It actually bends them up towards the top of the shell, which is insane. I have never seen this before. By tightening or loosening these screws, you can actually change the way the clicks on the U2 feel. Now, again, do not touch these, because I found out the hard way that these are actually factory tensioned. If you undo them too far, your click gets really wobbly. It still actuates, but it's really wobbly. And if you click them too far, the click just won't actuate at all. So it's just a very weird implementation. I have never seen a screw from the top shell like pull part of the board up before. It is such a weird implementation. When I asked ZOWIE why they did this really weird implementation with the main clicks with these screws, they told me it's for consistency and QC. Now, the big problem with this is that if you have to take your U2 apart for whatever reason, if something breaks on the inside, you have to take these screws out to open up your unit, which means you have to untension and retension your main clicks. And because you don't know how they're tensioned at the factory, you have to go off of feel. So I had to do this thing where I had to tap the main clicks until I reached a certain point. It was like I was tuning a zither or something. It was just a very annoying thing, and it was just really weird. I just don't really understand the implementation here. Like, it's cool, I understand the logic behind it, but it also just sucks in terms of repairability, because if once you unscrew these, you're never going to get them back to stock. So again, this is kind of one of those other really unique, borderline unnecessary design decisions on the U2 here. I like the concept of it. It's a cool idea, but I just don't really see a point to it being here on the U2. It just seems overcomplicated and just over-engineered for no reason. Alrighty, now let's talk about these side buttons. Now, thankfully, the side buttons on the U2 are normal, thank God. So there's no weird tension screws or anything weird on this one. So these are just standard, fairly large size plastic buttons. The back button is a lot larger than the front button, which is by design, which I actually really like. It makes it a lot easier to actuate the rear button, which is a really nice attention to detail. Unfortunately though, these are plastic buttons. They're not using the same coating as the rest of the mouse, which is really disappointing. This is very similar to the Vaxi mice, where I had the same problem, where the plastic side buttons that are uncoated just stand out like a sore thumb from the rest of the unit. And the exact same thing is on the U2 here. Now, to ZOWIE's credit, these are much larger non-pill shaped buttons. They're much easier to actuate and they're much more consistent, but it would have been nice to see the side buttons have the same coating as the rest of the shell, just because they do stand out like a sore thumb a little bit. Now, in terms of what's on the inside, unfortunately, due to the incredibly complex build quality of the U2, I wasn't able to get the switches out of the shell, because if I did so, it never would have gone back together. So I'm going to assume these are Wano white dots. It does say Wano on the side of the shell, so I just can't verify what the shell switch is. I reached out to ZOWIE to see if they'd tell me what the switch is, and they wouldn't tell me. I'm 99.9% sure it's a Wano white dot, because that's like the most common side button switch, and it feels like a Wano white dot. So I'm just going to say it's a Wano white dot. I could be wrong, but it's probably a Wano white dot. But I will say the side button implementation is actually very good. There's basically no pre or post travel on the side buttons due to how they're anchored in the top shell. They are just really, really well implemented. They feel really good. The only downside to them, in my opinion, is that they're not using the same coating as the rest of the shell, which is really disappointing to see. If they were coated same as the rest of the shell, they'd be a 10 out of 10 for me, but since they're not coated, they're not a 10 out of 10. They're more of like a 9 out of 10. All right, now when it comes to the scroll wheel, this is another very interesting part of the U2. Now the scroll wheel itself is this rubber wheel that's textured with these very thick bars, kind of like a bunch of Kit Kats, if that makes sense. A very thick scroll wheel. And now when it comes to the internals, this is where this gets very interesting again. The scroll wheel encoder is some kind of proprietary encoder I have never seen before. It's a very, very unique encoder. I'm assuming it's a collaboration between TTC or F-Switch with ZOWIE, or it's some proprietary stuff from ZOWIE themselves. But on the plus side, the scroll wheel switch is just a standard Wano blue shell switch, the same scroll wheel buttons we saw on the X2V2 and the X2H. Now, in terms of feeling, the scroll wheel is very sensitive and very light. So much so I actually thought my scroll wheel was broken when I got it out of the box. The scroll wheel reminds me a lot of the scroll wheel on the MX Master, where you could switch it into the free scroll mode. It feels like the free scroll mode, but with enough resistance from the actual scroll points to stop it. But like with enough force, you could absolutely get this wheel to spin. I will say the scroll wheel is quieter than previous ZOWIE scroll wheels. It's not that meat grinder scroll wheel anymore, but it definitely does still have some loudness to it. But it's a very weird implementation. Now, personally speaking, I don't use a scroll wheel in game for anything. I have it unbinded to pretty much everything in game, and I'm actually kind of glad I do, because I can very much see a possibility where I'm moving my hands or I'm adjusting my grip on the U2 for whatever reason, and I accidentally actuate the scroll wheel and cause it to switch weapons or something. For me personally, the scroll wheel is just way too light. If I had to put it into numbers, I would say it's like a 1 out of 10 in terms of resistance. I think it needs to be more of like a 3 to 4 in terms of scroll wheel resistance, because the current implementation is just way too light. So thankfully, I don't rely on the scroll wheel for anything in game. If I did, the scroll wheel would definitely be a problem, because I have a feeling I'd be accidentally actuating it constantly. Alrighty, now in terms of the tech inside the U2, this is pretty bog standard for a lot of mice we've seen lately, so no real surprises here. It is using the standard 3395 DMT6Q for the main sensor. Now this is the adjusted version of the 3395, so it does have a lower DPI. It does not have the 26,000 DPI we normally see. It is the lockdown version with a max of 3200. The sensor does have motion sync enabled, but ripple and angle snapping is disabled, but this is pretty common for the lockdown version. The sensor does have 3 LOD levels. It has report rates of 125, 500, and 1000. There is no 4 or 8K yet, which is surprising considering pretty much every single other manufacturer, including Logitech now, have moved to some kind of high polling rate. And ZOWIE did include this advanced receiver, which seems like something that would operate with 4 and 8K polling rate, but it's not enabled as of yet. So I'm assuming we're going to see hot down the line, but as of right now, there's no support for that. Unfortunately, you are capped to 1K polling. And then when it comes to the MCU, this is a slight change from the normal 52840 we normally see. This one's using the 52833, which is the same MCU we saw on the recent Pulsar mice as well. It worked completely fine, and it does support high polling rates as well. So if ZOWIE does want to add 4 or 8K polling rate down the line, this MCU will be capable of supporting that. Alrighty, next up, let's talk about connectivity. So the U2 does have 2 connectivity modes, one of them being the USB-C connection towards the front of the mouse, and the other one being the 2.4 gigahertz. Now there is something rather unique about the U2, because this mouse does actually come with 2 wireless dongles. There is a standard small form factor USB-C to USB-A dongle with a USB-A dongle, of course. And then there is also the enhanced receiver, which also does double as a charging dock. Now I will say for my testing, I used the enhanced receiver a lot more than I did with the USB-A dongle. Now I didn't do that because the enhanced receiver has better wireless tech, as they claimed, as I talked about in the top of the video. I didn't notice the difference between the two, but I am in a very low interference environment, so maybe I didn't notice it, maybe other people will. Only reason I used the enhanced receiver is because it doubled as a charging dock, and it just was really convenient to use. So I didn't really notice the difference between the two. They were pretty much the same. I just like the ability to charge it via the dock instead of with the cable. That's the only reason I use the enhanced receiver. All right, now when it comes to the battery inside the U2, hidden away in the bottom of the shell, we find a 300 milliamp hour battery. Now this is a pretty common battery size. However, the battery life we see on the U2 is a little lower than a lot of the other battery life we see on similarly sized batteries in other mice. ZOWIE is claiming the U2 is rated for around 70 hours of constant use. However, they didn't specify what battery level it was tested on, what performance mode and that kind of stuff. So from my testing testing running the U2 on 1K polling rate at 1600 DPI, the battery life was around the 60 to 65 hour mark. So the battery life was a little under spec for my case, but again, that may not be your situation. Again, it is very cold up here in Canada right now. We're getting a winter in March right now, so it could be that affecting the battery life, but it is what it is. When I'm talking about the battery life, I also wanted to talk about the charging. Now, one really common irk I have with a lot of mice lately, specifically mice like the Sprime PM1 and the ZOWIE U2, is custom sized USB-C ports. And unfortunately, the U2 does have these same custom sized USB-C ports. You have to use the cables that come with the U2 to use this mouse, and the dock actually. Third-party cables will not work. This is going to shock probably a lot of you. I'm actually going to give ZOWIE a pass here because they have a valid reason for doing so, because the U2 itself and the U2 dock does have a bunch of anti-interference tech on it, and they need specialized cables to perform this. So I'm actually going to give them a pass here because ZOWIE has a valid reason for having you only use it with specific cables that come with the mouse. I would much rather see being a universal implementation, but since you have the convenience of the charging dock and you don't really rely on the cables that much anyways, I'm going to give them a pass here. Again, I don't mind it if you have a valid reason for it. If ZOWIE just put them in here and they had absolutely no reason for it, I'd be a lot more upset about this. But given that there is a reason for the customized USB-C ports, I'm going to be giving them a pass here. All right, now in terms of onboard controls and software, in traditional ZOWIE style, there are lots of onboard controls on here, and this mouse is completely driverless, so you can do everything you need to do to adjust things on the U2 via the on-unit controls. On the base here, we have a polling rate button, a DPI button, both with corresponding LED lights to show the levels, and we have a power slider. Now this power slider is actually really cool because it lets you pick between using the 2.4 GHz USB-A dongle or the enhanced receiver, which is a really nice attention to detail. Now, for time's sake, and this video is already pretty long, I'm not going to talk about the button combinations. ZOWIE does include a full user manual in the box, which just tell you how to do everything. I wish this was on the MP1 OS when I got that one from Vaxi, because that mouse was very confusing to learn. The user experience for the onboard controls is significantly better here on the ZOWIE mouse because it comes with a manual in the box. That's a really nice attention to detail here from ZOWIE. But overall, the onboard controls implementation is very solid. No complaints from me. And again, I'm really glad they had a user manual here because it has made the user experience so much better. Alrighty, now when it comes to repairability, this is one area where the U2 is going to be getting a very bad grade. Now, I will say the repairability is severely hampered by this custom tensioning clicks that we talked about earlier, because you have to take those screws out to take the unit apart. It just basically negates any chance of you repairing this unit yourself just because of these tensioning screws. On top of that, a lot of those screws inside the unit are also tensioned, and there is so many screws in this thing. As I mentioned before when I talked about the build quality, this thing is almost over-engineered to a fault in the middle, and there is no chance I will ever be able to take this mouse apart and put it back together. There are just too many screws. Too many of the screws are tensioned. It's just a nightmare to try and repair yourself. So do not take this unit apart under any circumstances. ZOWIE takes repairs for the units under warranty. Send it to ZOWIE. Don't even try to do it yourself. Even with me and my expertise in this area, I'm not even going to try and do a teardown video on this mouse, because if I take this mouse apart, there is absolutely no way I'm getting this mouse back together in one piece. So repairability is going to be a 0 out of 10. It is the least repairable mouse I have ever seen, but at least as compared to other brands, you can send your mouse to ZOWIE to have it repaired, where a lot of brands don't have that option. So that is a plus, but it doesn't excuse the unrepairability of the U2, because it is just extremely complex and no one should take this unit apart under any circumstances. Alrighty, well, in closing thoughts, this is a very unique mouse. I know I've said unique mouse a lot this review, but this truly is a very unique mouse. I do overall think the U2 is a good mouse. However, it's only good for medium hands. The shape of the mouse is far too limiting for smaller and larger hands, and I fall into the latter category, and as such, I just had so many issues with the U2 in terms of grip styles. It just really wasn't a good fit for me. If you have medium-sized hands, U2 is going to be perfect, but for other hand sizes, it definitely does struggle. Aside from that, the vagueness of their marketing is really frustrating from a reviewer's perspective, because I really wanted to actually talk about all these cool scientific features on the U2, but because I can't verify them and because ZOWIE doesn't provide any proof of those claims, even though they have proof, it makes it very difficult for me to actually talk about a lot of the features of this mouse. As a reviewer, it's very awkward for me to do so. So I would really love to see ZOWIE provide some data on their product pages and to reviewers so they can actually verify some of these claims, because it's really frustrating to review this mouse without that. Aside from that, there are of course some other improvements I'd like to see. I really do think that the top right shell of the mouse should be changed to allow for better anchoring of the ring and pinky finger. The stock skates on the U2 should be changed, in my opinion, to either speed skates or control half-size skates to better complement the dynamic aim use case of the U2, because the current skates kind of fight against that with how controlled they are. The side buttons should be using the same coating as the rest of the shell, of course. The scroll wheel is far too light, it's much too easy to actuate, and again, as I mentioned before, the size limitations with the U2 is really only good for medium hands. It would be really nice to see them release a large and a small version of this mouse, because I have a feeling a larger U2 would be perfect for my hand size or larger hands, and a smaller U2 would fill the gap in terms of smaller hands as well. And as has been with all of ZOWIE's previous mice, they do often have multiple sizes, so I'm hoping we'll see a larger U2 or a smaller U2 with some improvements in the future. But despite the vagueness of the marketing and some of the other issues with the U2, I really do think ZOWIE is on the right track here. I wasn't expecting their first mouse to be a more dynamic aiming focus mouse, and it's not perfect, but I do believe that the U2 is a good stepping stone into ZOWIE's next chapter, and they're finally moving into a more modern age, and I think the U2 is a step in the right direction. Of course, their first version of a dynamic focus mouse isn't going to be perfect. I don't think anyone is expecting this mouse to be perfect. I think the next iteration will be much better, but if you do want to learn more about the U2, I will have the product pages linked down in the description for you. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing to the channel, leaving a like on the video. That really helps. And if you'd like to support the channel directly and support what I'm doing here with the Teardown project and reviews here on the channel, you can become a member here on YouTube. It's only $2 Canadian a month. You get to support everything I do here on the channel, and you get your name shouted out at the end of my videos. So if you want to support the channel, you can become a member here. Thank you very much again to ZOWIE for sending the U2 over for review. I greatly appreciate the chance to work with them again. I hope my feedback is helpful to them, and I'm really excited to see what ZOWIE's next chapter is, because again, they're on a very interesting path right now. It's far from the beaten path, and I'm really interested to see what they come out with next. But that is going to be everything for today. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace.